In today's biased news, US prisons are still the worst in the world, Brazil goes green, and South Korea goes back in time. A new report by Solitary Watch indicates that over 120,000 people on any given day are in solitary confinement in the US. Solitary confinement is a form of imprisonment in which the inmate lives in a single tiny cell with little or no contact with other people. In the US, 86% of the general population supports restricting the use and the eventual abolishment of solitary confinement. That, however, doesn't stop the US prison system from leading the world in the practice, with some inmates only allowed one 5-minute phone call with family every 90 days. Similarly to the US prison system as a whole, the practice is intensely racialized, with the vast majority of inmates being Hispanic or Black. The average solitary confinement cell is about the size of a parking space, and is intentionally restricted from natural light, activity space, and other stimuli. Jean Casella, the director of an organization dedicated to monitoring and resisting the use of the practice, says, quote, "The widespread use of solitary confinement in our prisons and jails is a humanitarian crisis. As the United Nations has confirmed, it's torture taking place on US soil." Most countries consider solitary confinement beyond 15 days a violation of human rights. However, in the US, it isn't unheard of for someone to spend upwards of 25 years in solitary. Modern research is clear on the destructive effect the practice has on a person's psychology, with just a single week in isolation causing potentially permanent changes in electrical activity in the brain. The practice has frequently been referred to through euphemisms such as administrative segregation or restrictive housing. No serious attempts have been made in state legal code to minimize or eliminate the use of solitary confinement, and no proper legal channels exist for inmates to challenge the institution. Those that have attempted hunger strikes or other similar actions have faced retaliation from prison authorities, which routinely block media coverage of any strike action by prisoners. Solitary confinement is a vicious practice, continued despite a severe mental toll on inmates, as well as increased recidivism for those in solitary, and higher costs to maintain the institution. In a country taking pride in its "Land of the Free" slogan, the US prison population is the largest in the world, and rehabilitative efforts take a back seat to barbaric practices that maintain institutionalized racism, company profits through cheap labor, and an industrial rate of incarceration. Brazil aims to pass a regulatory framework for offshore wind and green hydrogen by the end of this year as part of its efforts to power its energy transition and overhaul its environmental credentials. The country currently lacks legislation to regulate offshore wind and hydrogen, but the government plans to establish a safe regulatory framework. State-owned oil company Petrobras faces challenges in replenishing its oil reserves, and environmental regulators recently blocked its plans to explore near the Amazon River. The government will also decide this year on whether to resume work on the Angra 3 nuclear plant, considering the need for energy security and potential higher costs for consumers. In Russia, we're getting more information about the cancelled Wagner mutiny. From Wagner's side, Prigozhin stated that the reason for the mutiny was the looming attempt at abolishing the PMC, coming in July. On the other side, Belarusian President Lukashenko claims that he convinced President Putin not to harm Prigozhin during the stressful events of last week. The Kremlin had portrayed the situation as a mutiny that could lead to a civil war in Russia. Initially, Putin vowed to crush this mutiny, drawing a ludicrous parallel with the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution and subsequent civil war. However, a deal was eventually reached to allow Prigozhin and some of his fighters to seek refuge in Belarus. Lukashenko has suggested to Putin that they engage in dialogue with Prigozhin and his commanders. But thus far, Putin has expressed skepticism, claiming that Prigozhin has refused to communicate with anyone. In France, clashes have broken out between demonstrators and police following public outrage over the shooting death of a 17-year-old in a Paris suburb. 9 people were arrested in the confrontations, according to the police. The officer accused of firing on the driver has been arrested on homicide charges, which might come as a shock to Americans, who are used to police murdering US citizens without repercussions. Speaking of the US, home sales surged in May, as buyers look to new construction as an alternative to the low inventory of existing homes on the market. Sales of newly constructed homes were up 12.2% month over month in May, and up 20% from a year ago, according to a joint report from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development and the U.S. Census Bureau. home prices seem to be dropping a bit too. That being said, owning a home, an integral part of the American dream, remains out of reach for the vast majority of working Americans. And in interesting, if not entirely positive news, South Koreans became a year or two younger on Wednesday, as new laws that require using only the international method of counting age took effect, replacing the country's traditional method. In December, South Korea passed laws to scrap the traditional method and fully adopt the international standard. While skeptics rightly point out this is a pretty creative way to do pension reform, I'm sure most of us wouldn't mind pretending we're a few years younger. That's all for today. We'll be back day after tomorrow with more news. If you'd like to see episodes with more in-depth analysis, consider supporting the show on Patreon so we can grow and expand.